Welcome to SkepTalks, the show where I introduce you to speakers from around the world. Each one of them will present to you their favorite topic. In this first episode, I introduce you to Jarret Ruminski. He is a research consultant, writer, and recovering academic who does consulting work for several Canadian nonprofit and governmental organizations. He also holds a PhD in American history from the University of Calgary, where he taught courses in American, Latin American, and world history. On the 14th of May, he was at the Toronto office of the Centre for Inquiry Canada, where he spoke about Bigfoot and pseudoscience, two topics that have fascinated him since he was a monster-smitten youngster.
Do my best here. Okay, so let's get right into this. Bigfoot lives. Bigfoot's alive and well in the world today. And I don't mean it's a flesh and blood critter running around the forest. What I mean is that the search for Bigfoot continues. And in fact, it's actually pretty flourishing. And it's because of the information age. The idea of Bigfoot is flourishing because of the information age. And this might seem sort of paradoxical, because the 21st century world, I'm going to drop my mic, sorry. We're characterized by fast digital global communications, the internet age. It's an urban world also. The majority of the human population at this point, 54%, now lives in cities. Sorry about that. And the percentage is growing every year, according to the United Nations. And moreover, the global economy has brought about a steep decline in the world's forest cover, depending on who you ask. And so thus we have an urbanized, digitally connected world in which more and more of the human population has less and less contact with nature. And so why in the heck does Bigfoot There you go, sorry. Why in the heck does Bigfoot still survive? Bigfoot lives on because the world is more connected, it's more urban, and it's increasingly less beholden to traditional authority figures, whether they be scientific authorities, political authorities, authority figures in general. The notion of authority is really being challenged these days, and that's really because of the information age, I think. In a digitally networked global society where people exchange ideas at a lightning pace, and where all the influence of traditional knowledge gatekeepers really is waning, Bigfoot provides people with an emotional connection to nature, especially in an urbanized world where fewer and fewer people actually experience nature. But they can experience nature through Bigfoot. You might say there's other ways, and I would agree, but for some people, Bigfoot is the key. And this elusive cryptid also provides a lot of stability. And it gives people a sense of release via the notions that there are still mysteries in the world, that regular salt-of-the-earth people can still make great discoveries, and that so-called professionals don't know as much as they think they do. That's going to be a running theme through this whole talk. Let's just give you a sense, before I go further, about the real urbanized world we live in. 80% of the Canadian population and 81% of the US population lives in cities now. And that's a trend that is happening even in developing countries. Let's just keep that in mind. This is just another representation. So the human footprint in North America, right? The red is where people live. The green is where Bigfoot lives. And I think this will make more sense as I go along. But before I go further, we're going to talk about subcultures. Bigfooting, or Sasquatching, or squatching, whatever you want to call it, is a modern subculture. Now, subcultures are cultures within cultures, and they're made up of a large number of groups with which people identify, and with which they derive distinctive values and norms, and a bunch of rules for their behavior. And they exist always in relation to larger, more dominant cultures. Now, the Bigfoot subculture in particular marinates itself in all kinds of conspiratorial contexts that reflect broader societal trends. And these include, as I said, suspicion of professional scientists, suspicion of elites in general, and the declining role that institutions like organized religions, governments, etc. play in human society these days. Now, the information age distributes these conspiratorial contexts to millions of people every day, the internet, right? And especially in Western countries, industrialized Western countries like Canada and the US, which is ground zero for Bigfoot, it's really a North American phenomenon, has this instantaneous flow of unregulated information, and it doesn't suffer any peer review beyond the people who exchange it. This is one thing that helps keep Bigfoot alive. We all have a general idea about what the information age is. It's the era of the internet, of instant communication, but I'm really serious about this topic on some level, so I'm going to actually provide a scholarly definition. It's from the Spanish sociologist named Manuel Castells. And he defines the information age, or you can call it the network society, as being characterized by the networking form of organization and by a culture of real virtuality constructed by a pervasive, interconnected, and diversified media system. Kind of academic-y, but it makes sense. And Castells argues that the new network society has created what he calls a space of flows and of timeless time. In other words, you've got continuous flows of information within distinct cultural channels. Message boards, websites, social media groups, podcasts. Podcasts are going to play a bigger role here. And these can all self-regulate and self-perpetuate. You're going to see when Bigfoot believers talk amongst themselves, they only talk amongst themselves. And this process of creating digital subcultures creates really powerful expressions of collective identity that include all kinds of proactive movements, as well as reactive movements. And the Bigfoot subculture really is a reactive movement. And even as the information age sort of threatens subcultures by splintering them into smaller and smaller little groups, it also allows them to thrive. It's sort of paradoxical, but it's one of those things when you have continuous flows of information. And the world of Bigfooting, as we're going to talk about here, existed way before the internet, of course. And while it's sort of ceased to be a mainstream topic, at least in terms of a seriously discussed mainstream topic, it's always going to be a pop culture subject. The internet has perpetuated it ineffably into this big contained subculture. And I should note, before we get into the Bigfoot subculture here, that my personal interest in this stems from going back, being a kid, going to a library. I think I first saw the Leonard Nimoy In Search Of series, where he talked about Bigfoot. I think it was in the late 70s, right? And I've been fascinated by this thing. I can't really explain why entirely, but I started off reading about, some of the major Bigfoot authors, which I'll discuss. And as you get older, though, and you hopefully get a little more critical, you realize that this actually isn't an animal that actually exists, but people keep believing in it. Year after year, there's no Bigfoot body. There's no evidence really whatsoever beyond kind of vague footprints. So this isn't going to be a talk about the evidence for its existence or not. I'm about 99% sure it doesn't exist. I'm holding out because I really want it to exist. That would be awesome, but we work with what we're given, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to focus on why the information age keeps Bigfoot real to so many people. And I want to try to understand why they believe what they believe, and what belief in Bigfoot can also tell us about some seriously significant issues affecting society in the 21st century. Just an example of Bigfoot in pop culture. He's definitely a Canadian icon. So, cryptozoology encompasses all kinds of critters: Bigfoot, Loch Ness, chupacabras, anything that is supposed to exist but science doesn't recognize, that can crawl, creep, whatever. Cryptozoologists look for these things. It's a pseudoscience, but it's a mainstream, sort of mainstream term at this point. And Bigfoot, though, is less a creature of cryptozoology initially. He's initially a creature of pop culture, and that's where we're going to sort of begin here. We're going to begin with a little history. I'm trained as a historian, that's my background, so I got to throw some history, but it's really going to help put this whole thing in context. So we're going to start with the first wave, what I call the classic era of Bigfoot. It's a long era, and there are some scholars who have written about Bigfoot that I'm going to talk about, and they've kind of subdivided this into a whole bunch of different epochs or whatever. But I'm going to kind of crunch it down for time's sake here. And what we think of the pop culture conception of Bigfoot begins in Canada. It begins as Sasquatch, not Bigfoot. With this guy here, John Burns. So we're going to begin with two events. They're separated by about 29 years, but they're connected through the people and the media that turn these events into a decades-long phenomenon that spawns a whole new subculture. And it's all dedicated to finding North America's great ape, and it still thrives. So beginning in 1929, John Burns, he's a teacher. He's working at the Chehalis Reservation near the town of Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia. He published a collection of tales detailing the supposed existence, of a race of giants that lived high in the Canadian mountains in an article originally published in Maclean's. And although these native tales vary across the board about wild people, wild men, wild women, Burns synthesized them under a general category which he called Sasquatch. And this is a term he coined by anglicizing a word from the Hokuman language of the Coast Salish people. I can't pronounce the word, I'm not going to try. And these tales about the wild man, which first published in Maclean's, and then he publishes subsequent stories about the wild man of British Columbia's forest, they grow, and they get more popular across Canada and eventually into the US. As one skeptic observes, quote, all of modern Bigfoot mythology grew from this regional seed. So thank you, BC. And Burns's tale attracted two guys who are going to be essential to this little story tonight. John Green and Rene de Hinden, two Canadians. And these guys are going to become what we call godfathers of the Bigfoot subculture. Founding fathers, perhaps, even. There's John Green on top and Rene de Hinden on the bottom. John Green is a newspaper publisher, and he's based near Harrison Hot Springs. He's still there. He became convinced that Sasquatch was more than a myth after reading the Burns tales. And he's a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism, and he's really a gifted narrative writer. He has published a lot of books, and they're really fascinating to read. He's a hell of a writer. And over several decades, he compiled thousands, literally thousands, of Sasquatch sightings into several books, which are pretty widely available still in print. And they kind of still serve as kind of revealed scripture for Bigfooters. And Rene de Hinden. Now, Rene de Hinden, these guys are going to interlap their whole lives. They're going to cross paths. They didn't hate each other, they didn't like each other either. But de Hinden was a pugnacious Swiss-born immigrant. And he had a notoriously prickly temperament. His usual go-to term for scientists was clodhoppers, for example. He came to Canada in 1953 and found his life's calling when he heard about the Sasquatch. He once told a reporter, I've been searching all my life for a chance like that, a chance to really accomplish something. During his lifetime, de Hinden probably was really the world's only full-time Sasquatch investigator, and I mean that literally. He became so obsessed with finding the beast that he actually left his wife and his child to hunt the creature full-time. He worked on occasion to earn money and put all of his investments into searching for the Sasquatch. He lived in a trailer. This was his life. Yeah, in an interview for the CBC, which you can still get online, I advise all of you to watch, it's really fascinating. Yeah, he told the CBC, we parted company, referring to his wife. We parted company in a nice way. You know, as adults, more or less. Somebody said the thing was either it's the Sasquatch or me, referring to his wife. And well, I choose the Sasquatch, right or wrong. I'm not crying about it. He's a fascinating character. I wish I could talk more about him. But we're going to get back to these two guys in a minute. But first we have to mention some other major events that really further drew them and a heck of a lot more people into the new Sasquatch subculture in the kind of early to mid-20th century. So we're going to move down to the US then, specifically Bluff Creek, California. While Green and de Hinden spent the 1950s investigating Sasquatch in Western Canada, the small mountain town of Bluff Creek became America's Sasquatch ground zero. In the late summer, early fall of 1958, this gentleman in the newspaper clip, his name is Jarret Ruminski. He's a Bluff Creek bulldozer operator, and he starts finding a bunch of huge footprints in the mud around his machines and his tracks. And he starts making plaster casts. And he took the cast to the local newspaper, the Humboldt Times, and they ran a story, this story, accompanied with a cruise picture. And they wondered, they were kind of treating it as sort of a, kind of a lighthearted thing, but they did wonder, is this a hoax, or is there a real undiscovered animal? Or, as it quoted, are these the actual marks of a huge but harmless wild man? Now these tracks have been studied. There's tons of casts, and I believe if you go to Bluff Creek today, there's a Bigfoot museum. You can see some of the original casts. But it's almost certainly the case that they were a hoax, perpetrated by this guy in the corner. This was Ray Wallace. He was a local contractor in Bluff Creek, and he had an insatiable need through his entire life. To quote the words of naturalist Michael Pyle, who's written about Bigfoot, Wallace had the need to build mountains of bullshit. He died in 2002, and his death was fairly widely reported in the U.S. and Canada as the death of Bigfoot, because it revealed that he'd been hoaxing Bigfoot tracks his entire life. His stepson showed the media the prints, the carved tracks that he made, and he even claimed at one point to be the figure in the famous Patterson-Gimlin film, which I'll bring up in a second here. That's never been verified, but the guy was essentially a lifelong hoaxer. One of the people who have written extensively about him said he was a working man who liked to have fun. But despite the shadow that Wallace cast over the Bluff Creek tracks in 1958, the Humboldt Times christens the track maker rather, as Bigfoot, 2 words. And this is where Bigfoot makes its mass media debut, really. They run subsequent stories about the creature, and they really forever turn Bigfoot into a media phenomenon. And also this makes Renee DeHinden and John Green, both of whom thought Bigfoot was America's version of Sasquatch, it turned them into lifelong researchers, and it turned a lot of other people into at least casual researchers. And Bigfoot's media stardom becomes way further solidified forever on October 25th of 1967, when a rodeo cowboy, and I should add consummate huckster, named Roger Patterson and a friend, Bob Gimlin, allegedly filmed a Sasquatch strolling along a river tributary in Bluff Creek. It's a tributary of the Klamath River in Northern California. And this is, for Bigfooters, this is the holy grail of Sasquatchiana, if you will, to this day. And I'm sure most of you have seen this, but we're going to play it, get it to a quick clip anyway. It's really actually unimpressive when you look at the full film. Usually if you see this on TV, you see it on being examined by all kinds of people. They've got the close-up of the Bigfoot, right? But this is how the original film is, and it's a copy of a copy of a copy at this point. But this is really still to this day what Bigfoot researchers, this is their main evidence. This is what they hang the evidence for Bigfoot on. Frame 352, right here. You can make up your own mind. You probably have seen this, most of you, before. You know, yeah, it doesn't do much for me. But this really circulates around the world. Renee DeHinden eventually gets ownership of the original film, and he starts touring this thing all over the place in the 60s, and charges people to, small-town theaters to see it throughout the U.S. and Canada. He even went to Russia and displayed it for a bunch of scientists there. So that's the PGF, as Bigfooters call it. So with that in mind, that's kind of the early and media storm of Bigfoot there. So with that in mind, let's start talking about amateur scientists and what constitutes the Bigfoot community. Now, as lifelong Sasquatch researchers, Green and DeHinden really embody the qualities that Bigfooters still embrace today. They're hard-nosed, they're no-nonsense, roll-up-the-sleeve amateur researchers. They're undeterred by the guffaws of professional eggheads who would tell them that this creature isn't real. And this salt-of-the-earth, anti-elitist approach really fits nicely with this kind of conspiratorial approach to science and the natural world that has always really engendered this kind of persecution complex among Bigfooters, and as a major theme I'm going to run through here. And now, I should add, we often associate conspiracy beliefs with really big stuff, right? Grand ideas, like the Illuminati, the New World Order, President Obama, right? But they don't have to be grand. They don't have to be big. Conspiracies can be small, too. Political science, this definition of a conspiracy theory comes from the political scientist Michael Barkin. It's a belief that an organization made up of individuals or groups was or is acting covertly to achieve some malevolent end. Now, according to Bigfooters, those people are scientists. And varying levels of paranoia really fuel conspiracy beliefs, or sociologists call it conspiracist ideation. People are drawn to conspiracy beliefs because these beliefs, they really provide a narrative to help explain the frustrations that they feel when they're trying to navigate this increasingly complex world. They provide clarity and a nice smooth narrative to otherwise really confusing events. And they're enabled by, again, the media age and this kind of democratization of information. I think Christopher Hitchens once said that conspiracy theories are the exhaust fumes of democracy. And I think that's really appropriate because when it comes to Bigfooting, they believe because the information is there and they can make what they want of it, they don't have to listen to authorities because the authorities are conspiring against them. And just a note that two scholars who have studied conspiracy beliefs note that narrative structuring of information is really central to human cognitions. Conspiracy theories are attractive because they provide their Manichaean narrative structures. They provide compelling explanations for otherwise confusing events. And that really is important here. It's a really complex world, we can all agree with that, and it's sometimes ignorance really is bliss. Now, Bigfooting has always been an us versus them phenomenon, in which you have these dedicated researchers, right, these guys here, for example, or squatchers. They position themselves as the curious truth seekers hell-bent on investigating a creature that a whole bunch of uninterested and possibly malevolent professional scientists have inexplicably refused to acknowledge via a conspiracy of silence. And according to Bigfooters, if scientists would only devote themselves to searching for the Sasquatch, its existence could be proven. And what really gets their goat is that the fact that scientists dismiss Bigfoot as sometimes, and they even mock Bigfoot researchers. The same Bigfoot researchers who are short on time and long on passion, right, that are going out into the field. They're looking for a straightforward, compelling explanation. And they think, well, if we just looked a little more, if we just spent one more year in the field, we'll find it. It's much more compelling, I think, for these people than it doesn't exist. Both John Green and Renee DeHinden, and I picked these two photos incidentally because this is the kind of image of the Bigfooter to this day. The guy literally rolls up his sleeves, gets out into the field, and does what the eggheads don't. He investigates the tracks. Or sheep, too. Green and DeHinden really kind of embody this us versus them phenomenon. The independent scholar named Joshua Blueboss, he's kind of written the definitive book, which you should all check out if you're even remotely interested in this stuff. It's called Bigfoot, The Life and Times of a Legend. He argues that Bigfooters embarked on what he calls a contest for dignity. And this is, he calls this a quest to delegitimize the middle-class autonomy of professional know-it-alls by proving that Bigfoot, the object of scientific scorn, is real. And you see this us versus them, this kind of salt of the earth versus the elitist approach in a lot of stuff, interviews and writings that Green produced over the years, and DeHinden too. Green once said that science is the pursuit of the unknown. Now maybe the scientists think there's nothing unknown, since they know it all and therefore they don't have to pursue it. DeHinden, who had no filter to speak of, was much more blunt when he described what he would do if he ever caught a Sasquatch. I would do this in a Swiss accent, but I can't. I'd take the scientists by the scruff of their collective neck and rub their goddamn faces in it, he said. And similarly, in 1996, he observed, while giving a lecture, I believe in Seattle, that I have no degrees, I have no PhD, and thanks God for that. You start out with a PhD, you already got 60 strikes against you. So neither Green and DeHinden were scientists then, and they were proud of that fact. They therefore really kind of serve as high-profile spokesmen for what became the first wave of Bigfoot subculture. And they're aided by the media dissemination of the tales of this creature through newspapers, men's magazines in particular, TV specials, Bigfoot newsletters, and pseudoscientific journals. There are a few out there still. And their audience, as Blueboss really identifies in his book, are primarily white working-class men. These are the guys who are looking for dignity. Blueboss notes that collecting Bigfoot media stories and launching their own expeditions to find the creature allowed Bigfooters to call the beast into being. So come back to this point. To go out and prove their manhood by supposedly taming the North American wilderness and finding and subduing its last one true wild monster. And Blueboss notes that it's not a coincidence that the height of the first wave of Bigfooting occurs in the 1970s. When you've got a whole bunch of broad-ranging social movements by minorities, by women, by students, and you have a declining economy that destroys a lot of blue-collar jobs in Canada and the US. And so catching Bigfoot allows white working-class men to stay on the top of the social order, so to speak. to lash out at all these forces that are conspiring against them. Not all white working class men, of course, but and it's not just a class thing, we're going to find out. So with that, we're going to talk about one of the other towering figures of early Sasquatchery, Dr. Grover Krantz. So the first wave of Bigfoot subculture isn't entirely limited to working class guys. Grover Krantz was a tenured professor of physical anthropology at Washington State University all his life. And the same media attention that drew Sasquatch, the same media attention to Sasquatch that brings in Green, DeHinden, and all these other people, also attracts Krantz. And due to his field of specialization, he latches on to purported Bigfoot tracks as well as the Patterson-Gimlin film as evidence for the creature's existence. Now, his study of Sasquatch was predictably detrimental to his scholarly career, but he had tenure. By the way, if you want to go see Grover Krantz, you can. He's right there. He donated his body as well as his dog's body to the Smithsonian, and he's on display to this day. A true physical anthropologist to the end. So Krantz, let's talk about Krantz's characteristics. Brian Regal, he's a historian of science who teaches at Keene University in New Jersey. He's written extensively on Krantz and about Bigfooting in general. And he notes that despite his scientific pedigrees, Krantz's personality traits, including a streak of paranoia, a real lust for stardom, and an overconfidence that really borders on arrogance, really clouded his ability to critically analyze Bigfoot and Bigfoot evidence. Now, Krantz acknowledges the problem of fake footprints, for example. He knows there's hoaxers out there. In fact, he examines some tracks and actually helps point out a hoaxer at one point. But he believed that his anthropological training really allowed him to spot the real thing. He was so obsessed with doing this that he actually kept two secret characteristics that he never ever wrote down, only in code, which has yet to be deciphered in his papers, that would supposedly allow him, two pieces of information that would allow him to prove a real track versus a fake. And he didn't want this information out there because he thought if the hoaxers got it, they could fool him then. Again, this speaks to his bit of paranoia. His papers are at the Smithsonian, and you can actually look at some of them online, and there are these codes written out with this information. It's actually really interesting. He once said that, "I don't think anyone outclasses me, at least not since Leonardo da Vinci." And unfortunately, though, for Dr. Krantz, a determined hoaxer had read his, actually that was on a TV special that he gave that quote, and then some guy saw it, some guy, I think it was in Chicago, and he got fed up with it, with Krantz's arrogance, and so what he does is he casts a fake track in a cat litter box, and he includes details like arcs, dermoglyphics, and he even puts walnut shells under it to look like the creature stepped on a walnut shell to kind of really give that authentic Sasquatch feel. And he sends it to Krantz to analyze, and Krantz buys it. So he could be fooled. And a lot of other people can be fooled too. So Krantz's arrogance also goes hand in hand, though, with his very paranoid, sort of conspiratorial view that others are out to squelch his work. He really, admittedly, wanted the fame that would come with identifying a Sasquatch, and his prime candidate was Gigantopithecus blacki, the Asian giant ape. He was really the first to kind of link that creature to Bigfoot. And so he wants the fame that comes with proving Bigfoot's existence. Unfortunately, he tries relentlessly to publish his research in scientific journals. He never gets anything published. Constantly rejected, so he starts thinking there's a conspiracy among other scientists in his own field to suppress his work. So what he does is he publishes it in some other areas. He's written a couple books, one of them Big Footprints. And so, like Green and DeHinden, Krantz spent much of his time trying to prove the existence of the elusive Sasquatch, even while he's doing normal professor stuff like teaching anthropology. And he pits himself as a truth seeker, undeterred by the howls of professional scoffers. But he always winds up empty-handed, though. Now, Green, DeHinden, and Krantz all failed to find Bigfoot. I think that's obvious at this point. DeHinden died in 2001. Krantz dies in 2002. John Green is in his late 80s now, and he's retired from active Bigfoot research, but he still compiles reports to this day. So they never found the beast, but in a crucial sense, the efforts of these iconic Bigfooters weren't in vain. Because in the internet age, there are a bunch of dedicated next-generation cryptozoologists who consider these guys to be the founding fathers of Sasquatchery, and they're carrying on their work to this day. So with that in mind, let's talk about the second wave. Now the second wave of Bigfoot research, the subculture really, begins with the advent of the internet, and the digital age has been keeping the beast alive ever since. Now, before we go into that, I should note that the search for Sasquatch continues into the 1980s and 1990s, kind of after the peak of the first wave. And it even adds two bona fide academics to its rank. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, he's a tenured professor of primate anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who is still actively looking for Sasquatch. And Dr. John Bindernagel, a Canadian wildlife biologist who I believe works in BC. He's also retired at this point. I got to mention these guys because they're kind of the modern version of Grover Krantz's. They still write extensively on Bigfoot, but we're not going to talk about them all that much because they're not the ones that are driving the digital subculture of Bigfooting. They're kind of like the authority figures that regular Bigfooters go to for kind of to genuflect or whatever. So, as is the case with the first wave of Bigfootery, mass media really fuels this digital Bigfoot area. But the internet-driven information aids really spread Sasquatch information way farther, right? All around the world instantaneously. But for all these changes, though, the Bigfoot subculture still relies on two key themes, really. One of them is the conspiratorial beliefs that shady powers are suppressing the truth. And the other is this idea that dedicated amateurs really have to go boldly squatching where elite scientists refuse to squatch. So, before I get into my two specific examples of modern Bigfooters, let's talk a little bit about belief backgrounds, shall we? Let's put it simply, while there are a lot of obvious cranks and charlatans, nutcases within the Bigfoot field, I'm going to venture to say here that the majority of these people who look for Bigfoot, who are interested in Bigfoot, even if they don't go out looking for him, a majority of them are normal people in most every respect of their lives. In 2002, 4 sociologists from Baylor University in Texas published a book called Paranormal America, 2010, sorry. It's a scholarly study of paranormal beliefs in the United States. And this includes belief in Bigfoot, they categorize that. And they found that believers in the paranormal, they do share a little bit of group differences, right? Some of them, they tend to be minority groups with slightly less societal power, like women, minorities. And they generally, like by a percentage point only, tend to have lower levels of education and are slightly more prone to paranormal beliefs, and lower levels of income. But that's literally by a percentage point. People with high levels of education and high levels of income are also drawn to paranormal beliefs. In fact, the Baylor study found that more than 2/3, that's 69% of Americans, subscribe to some form of paranormal belief. Ghosts, Bigfoot, aliens, something. Some people might vehemently believe in one thing and dismiss another as hokum, right? So unless half of the US is crazy, which is a debatable point, I admit, the belief in the paranormal doesn't make you crazy. It makes you what one scholar calls a qualified normal. Because she believes that the paranormal is both normal and deviant at the same time. And people from all walks of life believe in the paranormal. It's not limited to just the poorly educated and the nutty. The 2005 Gallup poll, for example, hinted at this point when it found that 3 in 4 Americans held at least one paranormal belief. And when it comes to Bigfoot, a 2012 poll found that nearly 30% of Americans believe the creature is probably real, and that Americans are only slightly more likely to believe in Bigfoot than Canadians. In fact, another survey found that Americans are as likely to believe in Bigfoot as they are to believe in the Big Bang Theory, and they're only slightly more likely, by about 10%, to believe in evolution. So with this information in mind, let's move on to my two final kind of significant examples here of modern Bigfooting. Podcasting and the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. I will get to that. Both of these examples are going to kind of blend in with the history we've already given and really show why Bigfooting is integral to the internet age and why it flourishes, and also why it sort of eats itself alive all the time. So, the world of Bigfoot podcasts. Has anybody here ever listened to a Bigfoot podcast? Like, I'm literally the only one. I'm weird. I love this stuff because I'm fascinated by why people do this. Now, the digital era of Bigfootery really doesn't have a precise origin date, per se, but I'm going to use a good starting point as 2002, when this guy here, Brian Brown, he's a Minnesota-based digital marketer who has an interest in Sasquatch. he starts the online Bigfoot forums. And these still exist today as a popular discussion grounds for all things Squatch. And this kind of forum lays the groundwork for what will become a whole series of online Bigfoot discussion groups. And also from about 2006 to 2008, Brown produces the Bigfoot Information Podcast, this little gray one here. And he currently hosts the Irregular Bigfoot Show podcast, which I'm sad to say, as of last week, literally has ceased to exist. He quit. Check out some past episodes, though. It's entertaining. And why am I talking about podcasts? Is because they're a major part of the digital Bigfoot subculture. They're really how information and stories are shared amongst Bigfoot believers these days. If you go do a little perusal through iTunes, for example, that's still the primary depository for podcasts these days. You find over about 20 current and defunct podcasts that are specifically devoted to Bigfoot. But the number gets a heck of a lot bigger when you can include the dozens and dozens and dozens of cryptozoological, paranormal, and general monster-themed weird podcasts that all discuss Bigfoot at some point. And these numbers might seem small, and they kind of admittedly are within the grand scheme of things, but you got to consider that they reach thousands of listeners. And while most of these people are not looking for Sasquatch, most of these people are interested in Sasquatch. They wouldn't listen otherwise. Now, podcasts allow Bigfoot enthusiasts to share a contemporary wilderness folktale, stories they've accumulated over time. And the key notion behind these stories that they tell is that there are still mysteries in the forest, and that powerful forces are conspiring against this truth from coming out. And no podcast made more of an impact very recently than Sasquatch Chronicles. This is good stuff, trust me. Go on and listen to it. No Bigfoot podcast really creates a bigger story than Sasquatch Chronicles. It started as a free weekly show in November 3rd, 2013, so fairly recently. It started by these two guys. These guys are brothers. They live in Washington State, Wes Germer and Woody Pratt. And they also, one of their co-hosts is a longtime California-based Bigfoot researcher named William Jeffning, who claims to be Renee DeHinden's protege, although I think he's bullshitting on that, quite honestly. Sasquatch Chronicles took off in the Bigfoot world largely on the strength of Germer and Pratt's own alleged encounter. They claimed they had a terrifying encounter with not one, not two, but a hunting party of Bigfoots during a late-night drive up Washington State's Yakult Mountain in November of 2012. And this encounter, in turn, inspired them to research Bigfoot and start a podcast. And there's one reason in particular why this show is really popular. That is a direct quote from one of the guests they had on the show. The show's frequent discussions of Bigfoot allegedly attacking and killing people, this is constant, and all these events are supposedly covered up by shadowy government agencies, contributed to its appeal. It became so popular that in December of 2014, very recently, the hosts started launching a website based around the podcast, and they began charging $7 a month for exclusive content for listeners. Perhaps not coincidentally, after Sasquatch Chronicles starts offering subscriber-only exclusive content, the stories get a hell of a lot more crazy. They become more outlandish, and they ultimately culminate. That never happened, by the way. But I thought, although there is an alleged story told within Bigfoot folklore that Teddy Roosevelt allegedly knew a guy who shot a Sasquatch, so I don't think it looked like that. So the conspiracy tales on Sasquatch Chronicles culminate with one guy and one kind of series of events. Bob Jarret. Oh boy. Now Bob Jarret is a Texas-based Bigfooter who appeared on the show and claimed that he found a torn-up camp in the Sam Houston National Forest, which he then filmed and posted on YouTube. A torn-up campsite, you know, beer cans and stuff, strewn, ripped-up tent, all that stuff. And his conclusion was that Bigfoot destroyed the camp, killed the campers, and that government agencies covered it up. A reasonable conclusion. On the January 9th and 11th, 2014 episodes, both of them titled Down the Rabbit Hole, Jarret wove an elaborate conspiracy tale. He claimed that a government agency forced him to take down his YouTube videos, covered up the campsite murders, and sent agents out, MIBs, Men in Black, to physically intimidate him and his family in order to scare him into ceasing his Bigfoot research. In fact, so determined was the government to keep Bigfoot a secret that they allegedly remotely hacked into Jarret's computer and removed all of his evidence of the creature's existence, including 2 alleged videos that supposedly depicted 2 Sasquatches chasing a herd of hogs. It is Texas. Other guests on the program asserted that what Jarret experienced was part of a larger Bigfoot cover-up. They had police officers, they had supposed wildlife agents, they had former forest rangers, all these guys corroborating this story. It is fascinating listening. But lest you lose faith in humanity, the absurdity of these stories actually irks some of Sasquatch Chronicles listeners. Show-themed blog discussions and a lot of threads on Reddit, and it's the popular online social media community where they discuss everything, they accuse the podcast of jumping the shark by peddling these kind of conspiracy nonsense. But, even as some podcast listeners cried foul, others actually bought into the whole conspiracy claims. Fans of the show on Facebook and other forums really wholeheartedly agreed that the U.S. government was actively involved in covering up Sasquatch, and that Bob Jarret, had been personally targeted by government agents. So there's kind of a two-sided split that happens. So yeah, Sasquatch Chronicles conspiracies alienate some, and they really, Bigfooting didn't used to have this aspect that we associate more with UFO belief, right? Government cover-ups and stuff. This is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. I've been following this subculture for literally decades now, probably longer, and this is only recent, like say in the last 3 or 4 years actually. Really when Bigfoot takes off on the internet. It really actually gets a whole lot of new subscribers to their show, even though some of them leave. But it can't last all that long, because Sasquatch Chronicles' penchant for spinning wild yarns catches up with it in March of 2015. This is kind of happening in real time while I was writing this thing. When a couple of some anonymous online critics discovered that there had been no moon on the night that the hosts, Groomer and Pratt, had their alleged encounter with a Bigfoot hunting party. And why this was so important was because their entire story, which they told for like an hour on one of the episodes, hinged on the fact that the moon was so bright and full that they could see the eyes of the creatures climbing in trees, running in front of their truck, everything. So this creates Bigfoot anarchy within the podcast community. There's a whole lot of online debate. Is the show built on a fraud? We can't trust these guys. They're lying, and they're charging us $7 a month to hear this stuff. Now, of course, following these allegations, the hosts vehemently deny anything that happened, and I think one of them even wanted to claim that, oh, we mistook the night, and it was actually solar flares that caused the light that allowed us to see Sasquatch. Well, a lot of people didn't buy that either. I'm not sure if that would work. I'm not into astronomy that much, but nonetheless, the show really went into free fall for a while. 2 of its co-hosts abruptly quit. They had other co-hosts. And hordes of listeners unsubscribed. Other Bigfoot-related podcasts and media start debating what's going on with this particular podcast because it was so popular. But even as plenty of people abandoned the show, a lot of people support it. They defend the show and its host, claiming that the critics of the show were either trolls or government disinformation agents working to sabotage a podcast that was getting too close to the truth about Sasquatch. What emerges is a bunch of multiple interwoven conspiracy theories. 1, the government was conspiring to suppress the truth about Sasquatch. Or 2, Sasquatch Chronicles hosts were conspiring to make money from a bogus story about Sasquatch. 3, online trolls were conspiring to destroy the podcast about Sasquatch. And 4, government agents were conspiring to destroy the podcast about Sasquatch. Now all this drama over the internet's most popular Bigfoot podcast really demonstrates how the information age helps forge the modern Bigfoot subculture via this really potent mixture of wilderness monster folklore, conspiracy tales, and really dedicated amateurs trying to prove the existence of an animal that scientists simply won't acknowledge. Another big theme on the show was that we're out doing the dirty work while these scoffers are in their ivory tower looking through a microscope or something. Now with that, this is my final portion of this presentation. We're going to go in a completely different direction here. Has anybody ever heard of this group before? You will now. The North American Wood Ape Conservancy, or the NAWAC. This is their official logo. You couldn't get more different from the conspiratorial world of Sasquatch Chronicles than these guys. But they do fit into this kind of the general themes that I'm talking about. And I find them actually a bit more interesting because they appear so uncrazy. So the group is originally called the Texas Bigfoot Research Conservancy. It's an all-volunteer, registered 501, tax-exempt nonprofit scientific research organization founded in 1999 in Texas. And I don't have it up here because it's long, but let me read you the group's mission statement. To investigate and conduct research regarding the existence of the unlisted primate species we refer to as the wood ape, also known as the Sasquatch or Bigfoot, to facilitate scientific, official, and government recognition, conservation, and protection of the species and its habitat, and to help further factual education and understanding to the public regarding the species with a focus on the continent of North America. These guys are serious. The group conducts extensive multi-month field investigations in Texas and Oklahoma primarily. And their primary research spot is a remote section of Oklahoma's Wichita Mountains. They also host an annual Texas Bigfoot Conference, which I believe was defunct for a few years, but it's coming back again this year. Gets hundreds of visitors every year. And when they have their Bigfoot Conference, they discuss their primary research area, Area X. This is apparently some private-owned land in Oklahoma's Wichita Mountains. Eastern Oklahoma is very heavily forested and mountainous. It's not kind of rolling plains as the western portion of it is. And Brian Brown, the podcaster who I mentioned earlier, is a member of this group, and he often kind of acts as their spokesperson, particularly through his podcasting. And while the group is based in Texas, they've got members across the U.S. and Canada, thanks again to the connections forged via the online Bigfoot subculture. Now, in contrast to Sasquatch Chronicles' craziness, this group is downright dull. They don't court media attention, they reject any notions of conspiracies and Sasquatch being paranormal, and they conduct a lot of field investigation with the sole intent of collecting a specimen for scientific recognition. They are explicit in their desire to kill one of these animals and bring them in for scientific examination. Nothing else will do. So how serious are they about this? Well, in March of 2015, they released their first major report, the Wichita Project Monograph. You can go on their website, woodape.org, and download this. It's actually pretty impressive. It's a staggeringly detailed, actually, 221-page report summarizing the background, hypothesis, methodology, and findings from their 4-year-long and still ongoing Area X field investigations. And that's a picture from one of them. That's their Operation Overwatch tent. Supposedly the creatures are nocturnal, and so I guess the black black tarp helps disguise it. While it's easy to discuss these guys as cranks, they're not in most senses, I don't think. They've collected no physical evidence, unsurprisingly, of Bigfoot to this point. In this report, you can go and view, primarily documents personal experiences they've had with the alleged creatures, doing all kinds of stuff, like, all kinds of wood ape activities. Such as the creatures tossing rocks at their cabin, using rocks to crush nuts, leaving tracks, using branches to knock on trees, what Bigfooters call wood knocking for communication, and making all kinds of weird vocalizations, huffs, growls, whistles, grunts, screams, and chattering, and all kinds of other stuff. Members of the group also claim to have seen the creatures. One of them even says he witnessed chimp-like juveniles climbing out of a tree and running off into the forest. They will readily admit that none of this constitutes any kind of scientific evidence. They're all personal experiences, and they're what they've got so far. And so while it's easy to dismiss a pay-to-listen podcast like Sasquatch Chronicles as kind of the work of either con artists or nutcases, the NAWAC is a bit more perplexing and more interesting, I think. They eschew the blustery anti-elitism of past Bigfooters, like Cranston to Hinden, for example, but they do nonetheless fit within the general Bigfoot tradition of dedicated amateurs researching what scientists ignore. Only one of the NAWC members, as far as I can tell, has a degree in wildlife ecology, just one. But they really do strive to emulate, to the best of their abilities, the work of field ecology. So, with that in mind, let's talk some concluding remarks here. So, after I've rambled on about all this stuff, why do these people believe, if they do in fact believe? And I think the NAWAC really does believe. In fact, Center for Inquiry, Brian Brown will probably talk to you via podcast report or any kind of interview. He will do that. He's actually given several interviews to Sharon Hill, who was a skeptic, who's affiliated with the Center for Inquiry in the U.S. In fact, she has agreed to review over his Reacher Project manuscript. So he doesn't court attention, but he'll give it if you want to talk to him. So why then? What the heck is going on? Let's bandy about some fancy stuff then. So again, the information age keeps Bigfoot subculture alive via all this shared digital transmission of stories, reports, and connections. Yet subcultures, they still need common beliefs in order to thrive. So the question remains, why in the heck are people believing this stuff? And I think, as much as I can postulate an answer, I should say, I think it lies with a confluence of multiple social, technological, and cultural factors. For one thing, pseudoscience really taps into this biologically innate human conceptions about the world. Intuitive conceptual frameworks, as one sociologist calls them. These are inherently intuitive. In other words, they're knowledge acquired without reason or inference. I'm sorry. They're acquired without reason and through inference. You just kind of feel it in your gut, I guess is the best way to explain it. And they manifest in all kinds of forms, often folk belief and religion, I should add. Their success stems from the fact that they get to us before science does. If you know anybody, or if you yourself were like raised in a particularly religious household, right, that got to you before science did. And that's hard to shake off, because it's intuitive. It's something that creates this real strong feeling within the human mind. And it's unfettered by science. Intuitive conceptual frameworks are irrational, but they're also more ingrained. They're shaped by feelings and cultural memes, and they take effort to shake off with reasoned scientific inquiry. And you have to, I might add, challenge really deeply held assumptions if you want to shake this stuff away. So many people don't do it. They don't want to. So pseudoscientific and paranormal beliefs then cluster around cultural attractors formed primarily by their intuitive appeal, unfettered by these institutional safeguards and reality checks that science tends to spew out. And one of these cultural memes is the wild man. The notion of a wild man is a worldwide cultural meme. Every society has a wild man myth because it taps into the intuitive memory of the evolutionary human past. A past before civilization as we know it, a past that represents the human connection to the lands and the forest. And technology and urbanization are gradually eroding the cultural memory of that past, which Bigfoot embodies, the wild man embodies. The Sasquatch hunters of the classic era, as well as the audiences for Sasquatch Chronicles and the researchers who make up the NAWAC, are looking for a monster that allegedly exists in the shadows of a predominantly urban mass culture that seems to harbor no more wild mysteries. In U.S. history, we call this a variation of the frontier thesis. The frontier has been conquered, there's nothing more to conquer, nothing more to discover. And I might add that because science must compete with these kind of intuitive yearning to reestablish this human connection to the wild, Bigfoot believers have always mistrusted scientific authorities, even as they have sought to emulate their methods, for example, or even when they were scientists themselves, because they view them as conspiring against the search for Sasquatch. And this is why this Bigfoot subculture is so rife with conspiracy theories, as perfectly demonstrated by the Sasquatch Chronicles breakdown. Studies have shown, sociological studies have shown a positive correlation between pseudoscientific and conspiratorial beliefs. That's not really surprising. And the reason for that is a greater propensity toward intuitive thinking may incline people toward belief in a diverse set of unsubstantiated claims. One of the major things about conspiracy theories is that you feel them in your gut, not in your head. And that's really powerful. The United States had a president that shot from his gut a lot. So it's really influential. Bigfoot believers have always believed that authority figures are conspiring against them because in their gut they know the creature is real. Rene DeHinden and Grover Krantz were suspicious of scientists, while contemporary Bigfooters fear the government. They're not so much against the scientists as they are the government, although scientists apparently work for the government to suppress this information. In addition, what one sociologist calls the self-sealed nature of pseudoscientific beliefs makes them rife for internal disruptions. And that's why Bigfootery is plagued with this kind of backbiting and infighting that we saw. And just think of this, the Sasquatch Chronicles story. The Sasquatch chronicles story of high government technology stifling the efforts of boots-on-the-ground, old-school wildlife trackers like Bob Garrett is a tale of the new order triumphing over the old one. The modern world's assault on what remains of humanity's need to reconnect with its wild past. And of course, the irony in all this, as you may notice, is that digital technology allows the Bigfoot subculture to thrive and allows people to connect through it. So it allows Bigfooters to instantaneously spread information about those people that are supposedly conspiring against them. So by combining a desire to get back to nature with a suspicion of authority, Bigfooters are reflecting broader trends in society, I might add, in general. Plenty of institutions like the Earth Institute have released reports in recent years, for example, that urge for various health and psychological reasons for people to get out into nature more. It's important. In addition, recent surveys coming out of the United States in particular show that about 10% of Americans subscribe to a wide range of conspiracy theories. And that percentage grows exponentially when you add anything regarding suspicion of the government. And this fits with a 2014 Gallup poll, for example, that found Americans' confidence in authoritative institutions is in decline across the board. Couldn't find a lot of good data in this respect in Canada, but I suspect it's got similar trends, if not quite as extreme. So the last portion then. In addition to all that, there's confirmation bias, and you've probably all heard of this before. I think this is at play especially with the NAWAC. All confirmation bias is the seeking or interpreting of evidence in ways that are partial to existing beliefs, expectations, or a hypothesis in hand. Basically, you're looking for what you already believe. Everybody's guilty of this at times. This is a human phenomenon. However, the Bigfoot believers are susceptible to its influence in addition to a whole lot of external influences, such as like what I've discussed, this desire to connect to the wilderness, etc. And this all culminates to strengthen their will to believe. Because confirmation bias preferences beliefs that are already held to be true. And studies have shown that due to confirmation bias, people who are presented with evidence that disproves their deeply held beliefs tend to become actually more entrenched in those beliefs. Because changing those beliefs will require a shift in their total underlying attitude, and nobody wants that. Thus, because Bigfooters believe in large part because they want to believe, they dismiss the overwhelming evidence that Bigfoot doesn't exist, and instead insist that if scientists would just look harder, again, if they'd just go out and look more, they'd find the beast. You get back to the NAWAC. What is the deal with these guys? Their evidence so far is based entirely on personal experiences, as I've said, a fact that they readily admit to. In fact, Brian Brown has said on multiple occasions, you know what? I believe what I saw, I know they're there, my job now is to get a body to show you that I'm right. So how do you explain these guys? What do we do with the fact that they've literally spent years in this tick-infested, muggy as hell Oklahoma forest where they firmly believe they've encountered giant undiscovered bipedal primates? I postulate 4 scenarios here. Number 1, they're lying. This is entirely likely. People don't need a reason to lie. People will make stuff up just to do it. One of the things about Bigfoot believers they'll say is, oh, well, you know, they have no reason. Somebody has no reason to make up a story. They're not getting paid. They're not getting media attention. In fact, they're probably getting scorned. You can make up something for the sheer perverse joy of hearing people believe it. So there's that. But you know, because these guys don't court attention, they kind of keep to themselves. I don't know about that. You know, if they're only lying, then they're lying to other Bigfoot believers. You know, which is a pretty small group. So it's possible, sure. Number 2, they're being hoaxed. This is also possible. They're on private land doing this research, a mixture of private and public land. Some of it's state-owned forest. So it's possible that there's landowners and people that are hoaxing them. Somebody's throwing rocks in their cabin, if in fact that's what they're seeing. That's possible. Although they'll point out why anybody would wear a monkey suit in 40+ degree humidity in the middle of summer in the forest, you know, fair enough. Number 3, they're actually seeing an unknown animal. This is not entirely out of the realm of possibility. The problem is, at this point, there would have been evidence for it. So I don't think that's really verifiable. And number 4, this is what I believe is most likely. They believe they're seeing an unknown animal. They believe it. NAWAC members go into the woods believing that Bigfoot exists. Some of them join the group because they claim they saw Bigfoot and they got interested in it. Some of them were just interested. They went into the forest and supposedly had an encounter and that made them a believer. So they're going in, they're primed for belief. And their commitment to pursuing Bigfoot is so strong that anything but confirmation of its existence would be a total letdown, a buzzkill, if you will. Because they expect to find Sasquatch, they find the creature regardless of whether it actually exists. This doesn't mean, however, that the NAWC members are crazy. Going back to that Baylor University study I referenced in 2010, those authors, being based in Baylor University in Texas, spent time with this group for the study. When they're researching the book, they went out on some of their field investigations. They joined the group, and some of its, they had one of their first investigations was called Operation Forest Vigil, which was 2 straight years of wildlife cameras left in the woods to try and capture the picture. Never got it. And the Baylor authors described these guys, and they went to their conference too, the Bigfoot conference in Texas, and they described conference attendees, for example, as, quote, remarkably normal, even hyper-conventional. They described the NAWAC Bigfoot hunters as, among whom I might add were a surgeon, a bank manager, several computer technicians, a professor. They described them as single-minded, focused, and serious, but nowhere near crazy. So, I'm going to leave you with a closing thought now. Because this video wouldn't load, I'm going to go over, actually I can do it here, I think. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Rene Dahinden, very briefly. This is from his CBC profile in 1976. You can watch it, it's about 15 minutes. Just listen for a second. Make sure the volume is up here. Can you guys make that louder by chance? If not, I'll read it, but you really got to hear this guy to appreciate him. Let me try it one again. If you can't hear it, I'll just read it. Can you hear that? No? All right. Bummer. But go home and watch this. Let me read what he says. Very short. I don't know what else there is that has this challenge. I couldn't see myself getting a steady job, 8 to 5, 2 weeks a year holiday, your nice circle of so-called friends, a $50,000 or $60,000 home which is paid off in 35 years. All this rubbish and totally unimportant things. If I would be forced to live that way, I think I would go behind the woodshed and blow my head off. Why do I end with that? Because here I think Dahinden really expresses the essence of the Bigfoot subculture, a distinctly anti-modern yearning for a more primal life, characterized not by the pursuit of material trappings, but by the pursuit of nature's mysteries, even in the face of the consistent, constant, relentless, unfair mockery of authority figures like scientists. And ironically, the anti-modern subculture is thriving thanks to very modern digital technology. And this has created a more connected, more urbanized, and less wild world, even as Bigfooters are trying to find the last wild mystery. The information age is keeping Bigfoot alive despite the fact that the beast represents everything antithetical to that age. You might say it's a conspiracy, almost. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this first episode of SkepTalks. Next time, Professor Jerry Coyne will introduce us to his latest book, Faith versus Fact.